Our text for this morning's message is Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. And this is in the midst of a narrative about Jacob going back to meet his estranged brother Esau, whom he fears will be full of anger and wanting vengeance on him. So it says, the same night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. May God bless this reading of the word. According to the Social Security Administration, over the past 100 years, the most popular name for a baby boy is James. And for a girl, it's Mary. And during that 100 years, the name David sat in the top spot only once, in 1960. That year, Mary was again first choice for baby girls. But the fashions change. In 2022, Liam was the first choice for boys and Olivia for girls. These days, we rarely meet a young person named Patience or Jedediah. The name Jacob did not make the top 10 this year, 2024. Sometimes we acquire nicknames, whether of our own choosing or from others. In my high school graduating class, an athletic young lady named Leslie went by Lard. And Nell went by Bambi. Jack was known as Dopey. And Jim was affectionately known as Boo Boo. In the Bible, a name change often signals some change in life situation. Naomi, which means pleasant, renamed herself Mara, which means bitter, after the loss of her husband and her 2 sons. In the New Testament, Saul became Paul, and Simon became Peter. And so, after a night of wrestling, Jacob was blessed and renamed Israel, that is, the one who strives with God. In our text this morning, we are following Jacob as he travels home with his family and all of his possessions to face his estranged brother Esau, his twin. In Genesis 25, you can read how Jacob was first named supplanter or grasper, or we might say trickster. We are told how Esau was his father's favorite and Jacob was his mother's favorite. Jacob, with the help of his mother, tricked his father into giving Jacob the blessing that was intended for Esau. And so then Jacob had to flee from his brother's wrath. Now, many years later, the time of reckoning has come for Jacob. He's returning home after many years with his father-in-law Laban, who himself had tricked Jacob. So now, after tricking Laban and heading home, Jacob the trickster must make amends for what he has done and must seek to reconcile with his twin brother Esau. His fear at seeing the face of his brother pours out in Jacob's prayer a few verses earlier in chapter 32, where he says to God, "Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother." Now, Jacob is worried that he and his estranged brother will pick up where they left off years ago. The messengers that Jacob sent out come back with ominous news. We read in the section of chapter 32, just before where we started, it says, "The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, 'We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him.' And then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed," the Bible says, "and he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and the herds and camels into 2 companies, thinking if Esau comes to the one company and destroys it, then the company that is left will escape." Along the way to a fearful encounter with Esau, Jacob wrestles with God and is renamed as though he had been born anew. The story starts off with us thinking that this is merely a man with whom Jacob is wrestling, but the author of this narrative leaves some ambiguity in there, and by the end of the story we realize that somehow God has been present in that strange midnight wrestling match, and Jacob's name is changed from Jacob to Israel. "Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children." For he thought, "I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me." So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself spent that night in the camp. And so that's where Jacob is as we meet him in our story today. Jacob, this calculating schemer, makes elaborate preparations to meet this estranged brother, and he sends gifts to soften him up, and he divides his possessions into 2 companies, trying to hedge his bets, so to speak. The Hebrew expression, "I may appease him," has the underlying sense of covering the face of the one who is angry. Jacob wants to set up a kind of veil between the angry face of Esau that he expects and his own guilty face. Jacob, the schemer, hoped to put off seeing the face of his twin brother. "Afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me," he imagined. With all of his preparations for the confrontation now complete, Jacob finds himself alone in the darkness that night. Jacob has always been able to live by his wits and to stay one step ahead of the consequences. We sometimes speak as though we could easily put the past behind us and move on, but we know that it's not always so easily done. Sometimes it's a physical injury in the past that we continue to struggle with in the present. Some families or congregations have repeated the same destructive cycles of behavior over the years. And in recent years, we have been made aware of massive clergy sexual abuse of children. And when we listen to the victims of that abuse talk about their lives since childhood, we realize how powerfully the past can carry into the present. Jacob had never faced up to his past, so he still carried it with him wherever he went. The story is told of a bishop in the days before the automobile who was driving to church in a horse and buggy, and he tied the horse outside the church and he went into the service, and a few hours later he came out to leave, and untying the horse he climbed into the buggy, calling to the horse to go. To his surprise, the wheels were dragging and the horse could not pull that buggy. And looking back, he saw that someone, some trickster, had piled his buggy full of heavy rocks. While wrapping the lines around the post, he unloaded all the rocks, unwrapped the lines, and he drove off home in his horse and buggy. And some 20 years later, there was a knock at his door one evening, and 3 middle-aged men were standing there nervously asking to speak with him. He invited them in, and after fidgeting for some time as they engaged in small talk, one finally said, "Bishop, do you remember one Sunday morning when there were rocks in your buggy?" The bishop threw back his head and laughed. "Do you mean to tell me that you have been carrying those rocks around all of these years? Why, I threw them out 20 years ago and forgot about it." Jacob is carrying within him his own history with his brother Esau and the crippling fear that went along with it. Of course, the 2 brothers did not pick up where they had left off. The Esau that Jacob feared was not the Esau who was coming to meet him. In the next chapter, in verse 4, we read about their meeting. 33, verse 4, it says, "But Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept." On his way home that night, before he met Esau, Jacob was wrestled to the ground, and somewhere through it all he found grace and was blessed. The author of our text deliberately leaves some ambiguity in this episode. At first, we're told that a man wrestled with Jacob. But by the end of this scene, we know that Jacob has in fact been wrestling with the God who stoops to engage each one of us where we live. In another state, long ago and far from here, I knew a retired pastor who claimed that he and his wife of over 50 years had never had an argument. And when I heard that, I guessed, but I did not say, that someone had been pulling her punches in that relationship. In a covenantal relationship of partnership, there must be some give and take as we encounter one another in ongoing dialogue. Educator Sandra Lebarsky has written, "In rabbinic tradition, Abraham is considered to be superior to Noah, even though Noah was completely obedient to God." Lebarsky wrote, "When Noah was informed that the world would be destroyed and that he should build an ark, he did just that. Abraham, on the other hand, once the impending destruction of Sodom was revealed to him, asked God to reconsider. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not forgive it for the 50 righteous who are in it?" Because Abraham engaged God as a responsible partner, rather than simply accepting God's dictum, he is judged to be more admirable than Noah. Lebarsky finished, she said, "It's this give and take that exemplifies the intimate relational structure of covenant in which wrestling is a legitimate form of coming to terms with the duties and responsibilities of partnership." Jacob wrestled in the darkness that night and held on through his pain until he received a new name and a blessing. The Dutch Catholic theologian Henry Nouwen let his own struggles and wrestling with God and the neighbors become the basis for his work titled "The Wounded Healer." We do not have to live very long before we are wounded by life in some way. Commenting on Jacob's wrestling experience that night, Nouwen said, "The hope is that Jacob, having wrestled with God, leaves Jabbok as a wounded healer, not as a wounded wounder. The hope is that out of his own woundedness, Jacob will open his heart to others." So we read in our text, "So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, 'For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved.' The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip." Using the image of beholding the face of another, the biblical writer has so skillfully woven together Jacob's encounter with the Holy God and the upcoming reconciliation with his estranged brother Esau. Old Testament scholar and theologian Walter Brueggemann has written, "In the Holy God, there is something of the estranged brother. And in the forgiving brother, there is something of the blessing God." Jacob has seen the face of God. Now he knows that seeing the face of Esau is like that. So we leave Jacob limping into the dawn. We know that our own woundedness can either open us to our fellow human beings, or we can allow it to close us in on ourselves. The Apostle Paul reminded the Corinthians that God uses our fallible and often wounded humanity to bring new life to the world through Christ. He wrote, "For it is the God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies." May this be true for each one of us this week. Amen.